Hello and welcome. Do you know, sometimes I get confused. I get confused sometimes when I'm going around doing things, right? When I'm engaging too much with the world outside my own head. For example, at the moment I'm in the Éigse Michael Hartnett. It's a festival to celebrate the work of the great poet Michael Hartnett, and it's held in Newcastle West in Limerick in Ireland. And I'm here sitting in a hotel room because I was doing an hour-long gig at 1 o'clock. And last night, I was in Portlaoise in the Dunamace Arts Centre, 2.5 hours away, where I was doing an evening with Michael Harding, which is really meditations and reflections on the book, All the Things Left Unsaid. Now, that was like 200 people in the audience last night, and maybe, I don't know what was in it today, much smaller. It was a nice, intimate little centre. People were having sandwiches, kind of a lunch, while I was talking. But I'm engaging with people, and you get the impression, well, he's out all the time talking to people. You know, he's an extrovert. He's living on the surface. In fact, when I'm not doing those things, I'm living a very solitary life with the cats. I'm looking out at the lake. I feel sometimes I'm living a cloistered life. I actually sometimes feel that my vocation was to be monastic, that I didn't achieve it within the conventional religious terms. Then I got married, fell in love, got married, and found that marriage actually provided me with a sort of a cloister, a sort of a space where you could be in solitude. And I think that's the wonderful thing about marriage, that somebody said it's like, I don't know who it was now, it was a scientist said that marriage is a place where eventually each person becomes the guardian of the other's solitude. There's some way whereby your presence to your partner allows your partner to find their own solitude. And that experience of solitude, to me, is absolutely vital, and it's the core, not just of where I find happiness, but where I find meaning. And every single podcast is really, in one way or another, a meditation on the music of that solitude. And I said, I was again doing a radio programme about 2 weeks ago, Joe Finnegan on Shannonside, and I was saying to him that, you know, you can go for support and help when you're ill to doctors or to therapists, or you can be supported by your friends and family, and you can kind of have people that look after you and mind you, and they can make you better, and they can heal you, and they can do an awful lot for you. But there's some bit inside you. There's some bit inside you that can only be healed in your own solitude. Only when you are alone. And then something really deep inside you can heal. And I told a story to kind of illustrate this point. And the story goes like this. This is true, by the way. I had a cat when I was about maybe 6 years of age. I wanted a cat, and the mother got me a cat, and it was a little kitten, and it arrived in a box with string on the box. And it would have been a wild cat, like it would have been a kitten that had been taken out of a farmyard somewhere, put in a box and arrived in our kitchen. And my mother said, don't open that box in the kitchen, because at the time we didn't have cats inside in the house. Cats were always outside in the shed. And that's the way I expected it would be. You know, you have a relationship with the cat that's out in the yard. That's the only way we thought about it. We didn't ever think about the cat being inside the house. So she says, don't open that box in the house. So, of course, I was 5 years of age, 6 years of age. I opened the box immediately in the house, in the kitchen. And the wee cat flew out of the box, flew up in the sky, and then gravity took hold and the cat started to come down, and there was a hot ring on the cooker. It was on full. You could hear the wee paw sizzling, and then the cat went sideways, and then it ended up out in the scullery. And it went behind a whole lot of biscuit tins. I used to come in the evenings and try and give that cat some food, some milk or something. I wouldn't be able to concentrate in school. I'd be trying to worry about the cat, and I'd come home, but the cat wouldn't come out. Not for about maybe 5 days, whatever. It was a long time. And then eventually the cat did come out. The little whiskers came around the corner, and the wee meow, and took a little bit of milk, and the cat was okay. Now that taught me something. It taught me, I'd never forgotten as a lesson, that the cat needed to be alone to heal. And I felt, and this still do feel, that sometimes there can be some pain inside you that only heals when you're on your own. And you need to go to that space to get the healing. It's a journey within. It's a journey into your own solitary, conscious mind. And it's a challenging place to do. It's a beautiful thing to do. And another thing, I believe that what you get in there is joy. There's a kind of a joy when you go really deep inside yourself, and nobody can give you that joy. You experience it just by being at the very centre of that solitary singularity of your own mind. Now, you could think that all the religious stuff that anybody ever talks about, including me, is in some way a kind of an elaboration of that basic truth. And I would not disagree with you. And that's why I go for solitude sometimes. Got the place in Donegal so that I could write. I would go up there, this was 2 years ago now, when I was writing the last book, and I would spend days and sometimes 2 or 3 weeks on my own up there writing. And that was a really good experience, and it's always been for me a good experience. The experience of, going away on your own to be solitary. There's some bliss happens. And I think that when you go to, the way you'd have monks going to the desert in Egypt or various places, they would go to be alone, a hermit. And I would read about that as a young man, and it made complete sense to me that the person wanted to be alone. And when I read stories about people like Abraham and prophets who would maybe go up into mountain caves to be alone, and then when they would be alone, they would hear the voice of God. And that made sense to me too, because it was like, well, they're putting the word God on the experience, but the experience is what is absolutely essential, fundamental, and it is the experience of solitude and the experience that in solitude you find joy. I'm not saying peace, I'm not saying happiness, I'm not saying any of those things. I'm using that word precisely, joy. And joy, it's like such an indescribable thing. But you know it, I know it. It comes sometimes when you least expect it. But it will come if you actually shape the context for it to get born. And the context you need to shape is solitude. And it's very hard in the modern day to get solitude. It's very hard to go away into the mountains. It's very hard to go away into the desert. We're not that privileged that we can do all those things that monks did, finding big, beautiful caves and the cliffs up in Egypt or somewhere, or in Skellig Michael. Living an urban life, living a busy life, living a mechanical, technological, digital life, how can you get solitude? Well, you then have to kind of get the cave or the desert as a metaphor. So like you might have a corner of the garden and you might say, this is my little cave. Or you might have some walk that you do. Might be through a beautiful park in the middle of a city. Or it might even be the streets of a city. And you say, this is my desert. This is my solitude. I'll actually tell you, there was a time where I did that, and it's when I used to go to Warsaw. So from probably about 2012, I'm not sure about the date, but about 2012 or earlier, up until recently, I used to go to Warsaw to write, to begin a new book. And I would take about 6 or 8 weeks. I would get a Ryanair flight, a cheap flight. I would get an Airbnb apartment. And it was like having another life outside my world of, family and who I am and what I have become in Ireland. You just vanished into this big world of Warsaw where nobody knew me. I wouldn't connect with, like I would have friends in Warsaw, but I wouldn't be going towards them. I'd be leaving them alone. I'd be living this solitary life. And I'd be in an apartment, maybe with a balcony, and I'd be looking out on the street. And I used to feel like a bird. I'd be thinking about a bird, a gannet or something, on the rocks around Skellig Michael, or, a gull somewhere on a cliff in the west of Ireland. And I used to think, I'm like living in a little cave. I'm like a bird living in a cave. Nobody knows I'm here. And it was a beautiful feeling. And then I would go down. I remember being on the 8th floor one time in an apartment I was renting. And God, there was a beautiful view of the city. Now, this was in February. So I used to go in the winter because it was cheap flights and then cheap accommodation, very cheap. The whole accommodation, the money I'd pay out wouldn't cover heating in Leitrim for the same 2 months. So there I'd be, and as I say, on one occasion I was 8 floors up. Well, I would go down in the lift and I would go walk, and I'd have a big grey anorak kind of insulated jacket on me. And the hood would be up. I'd have sort of a woolen hat inside the hood, and then the zip would come up to my nose so that it was only my eyes would be looking out. So you weren't breathing the exposed air, which was, I'm talking about -8 degrees. And thus I would walk the streets. And again, I used to imagine a bird among wild birds, walking on the beaches. You'd see them sometimes in winter, in places like Kerry or Donegal. And I'd feel like a bird walking among the other birds. In other words, all the people around me on the trams or in the street wouldn't be many of them. Sometimes on a winter's day, you could walk through Sasky Park and there'd be nobody in it. Nobody. And then maybe sometimes you'd see a homeless person in the cold. You'd see them sitting outside maybe a burger joint. And you'd look at their blue noses and their blue hands. An extraordinary amount of suffering manifesting in a human life when somebody becomes homeless. And you'd be looking at that, you'd be mingling in this world of pain and joy, but you'd be solitary. You would live in this beautiful solitude. I used to really enjoy that. I haven't done it for now for a good few years, I suppose, because of illness and because of COVID. COVID, I think the last time I was there was just before COVID. It was January of 2020. and I was watching the television news, and there was reports from China, and everybody was talking about this strange disease was in China, and that it was going to come, this virus. And sure enough, within 2 months, it nearly got to Leitrim before I got home. But those moments of solitude have always been for me the place to go for refuge. So that even no matter how much experience love with your family, there's a sense that you need also to have a refuge. And it's an interior place. It's obviously a version of what I sometimes refer to, what Jesus says, how do you pray? Go into the room inside in your heart and close the door, and therein be alone, and speak to your Father who listens to you, understands you in that moment. This penetration of your own heart to the very core of who you are is the way of prayer in all religions. I suppose what I'm saying now is that it also is very beneficial if you can externalize it. So that the very fact that you go to a little corner of the garden that you call, let's say, your cave, it actually triggers you to be alone. It triggers you to listen to your deepest inner voice. The outward expression triggers the inner experience. It'd be like, for example, go into a church, an Orthodox Christian, let's just say either of those. You go into a church and you look at the little flickering candles in front of an icon. You look at them and you leave. Now that is not as full and complete or as satisfying emotionally and spiritually as if you go in and actually light a candle. If you physically light a candle and place it in front of an icon, you leave the church feeling a deeper sense of fulfillment, a sense that it's not that the external is what's happening. It's not that prayer is some sort of rigmarole. It's that the external reality is kind of mirroring what's happening inside. So if you do it on the outside, your psyche inside your mind travels the journey on the inside. You'd see it also in Tibetan practices. You'd often see them sometimes if you're watching YouTube and you're looking at a Tibetan film. Mind you, there's a great film called Kundun, Kundun. Kundun was made by Martin Scorsese about His Holiness the Dalai Lama's life. It is a masterpiece by Scorsese. And you don't get it very often for certain reasons that I'm sure you know. It has been kind of erased from history. But if you Google it, Kundun, full movie, HD, Google it on YouTube and it will come up and you can watch it for free. And it is, I tell you, it's really worth watching. It's a beautiful, beautiful film. And you'll see people in it doing what I was about to mention, which is turning the wheel of like a prayer cylinder. So sometimes you'd see outside a monastery, there's these kind of cylinders that rotate. They'll be in a line, and the kind of pilgrims would be walking past them, and they would turn the wheel of each cylinder as they go, and there's prayers written on the cylinder, and you would think, well, that's hocus pocus. That's just like thinking that you turn an old can, spin it around, and that's a prayer. It is because it's happening internally when you do it externally. I mean, that's something that was missed for decades, maybe centuries, when we got so rational and reductive of the mysterious ways that the heart works. We began to think like only on the external. We began to see that, sure, rosaries make no sense because it's only a litany of the same thing and turning the beads. It's silly. And certainly turning these big wheels with prayers on them would be ridiculous. But that was an over-rational time. Everybody now agrees, understands that what happens in the external world ritually is what's happening on the internal. So, in relation to somewhere you go to be alone, you may not have a wonderful cave in Egypt, and you may not have even the luxury to go to an Airbnb in Warsaw like I do, but it could be just walking along a street. It could be a corner of the garden. It could be a shed. It could be somewhere that you feel alone. It becomes your cave. It becomes a place where you, if you like, where you meditate. I suppose it's a good word for it. Meditation is not one particular thing. There's a word in it in Tibetan, which I cannot say because I wouldn't know it, but it's some word like gum or gumba or something. Gum. And apparently in Tibetan the word means familiarity with. So that meditation, when they say the word meditation, they're meaning to become familiar with. That makes total sense. If you're on the internet every day and you're looking endlessly at YouTube, at Facebook, it's a kind of meditation. It's not a healthy meditation, but it's a kind of meditation. You're making yourself familiar with this every day. And if you were working, let's say, craft-wise, if you had a craft like knitting or carpentry, and every day, or music, and every day you're knitting and crocheting, or you're turning wood and making something beautiful with the wood, or you're playing a flute or a violin and learning a new tune every day, that's a kind of meditation too, because you're becoming familiar with something. You're going to a psychic space regularly and becoming familiar with that psychic space. And so meditation can be a whole lot of different things, but the absolute best is when you go into your own heart, into that room that's within the heart, and be still and listen. And the way to do that, or one way that will help you do it, is if you use external triggers. That's why churches are used, I suppose, because how beautiful it is. I always loved, if I was going to some place like Warsaw, I'd love to get an apartment which would be close to a church, and then I'd be able to walk. And the walk to the church becomes a kind of a pilgrimage. And then going into the church and lighting a candle in front of an icon becomes like a ritual, and that's happening on the inside. And then I would go, funny enough, in Warsaw, I would do that in the Orthodox church on the corner, the Cathedral of St. Magdalene, and I would go across the road then to a Costa Coffee and have a coffee, and I'd be sitting in the glass window looking out on the street, and I might sit there for 20 or 30 minutes, and that would be a pure meditation or pure prayer. Because the walk to the church, pilgrimage, the ritual of lighting a candle, prayer, triggered me into a complete zone of being absorbed with this mysterious sense of presence in solitude. And that's where joy comes from, I believe. I really do. Well, if I've said all that, it then it then comes to this contrast. For the past 10 days or so, I've been busy. I'm been busy at the surface. So I'm doing a show last night in Portlaoise. I'm here in Limerick and Newcastle West today at lunchtime, and I'm going out to enjoy another show now. So I'm really engaging with the world. And it kind of makes me discombobulated. It makes me almost uneasy. I'm longing to get home to the cloister, to the solitude of my trees, to the three little cats. They're like three little monks. Do you know what I mean? They never leave the cloister. They're always there. Even when I go away, I come back, the cats are there looking, sleeping in the same place. And I always feel cats like sleeping or looking at you when they're half asleep. God, they just remind me of the calmness and serenity that is available in meditation when there is what you call calm abiding. Now, there was another thing I did, and this is going to lead up to an interesting statement that will conclude this particular podcast. But there was an interesting thing I did last Sunday. I went over to Jampeling because they were having a special day. It's a day they have every year in Jampeling to kind of celebrate the long life. There's a fierce noise outside the window. Sorry about that. There's nothing I can do. I'm in a hotel. That was some big delivery truck. It was a special day celebrating the long life of the precious teacher, the Venerable Lama Panchen Utral Rinpoche. And they have a ceremony, a kind of it went on for 2 hours. They say what's called the purification practice of the 35 Buddhas. And then they say a long life mantra. And then they say a thing called the King of Prayers. It's like a full day, 2 hours of prayers celebrating the great life of this teacher, Tibetan Lama, who lives there. And I went over there because he became my teacher 30 years ago. And I haven't been over and I haven't been connecting with the centre at a regular level for a good long time. I suppose since, in one sense, probably since my illness started 10 years ago, and maybe even more so because I was praying with icons. Now, I was praying with icons, and I listen always to the advice of the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama says, don't make a soup of your practice. And I believe that what he means is Westerners tend to pick and choose about, what practices they do. And you'd be doing Tai Chi, and you'd be doing meditation, and you'd be doing yoga, and you'd be doing a little bit of Christian practice and going to Mass of a Sunday, and then you'd be doing your Tibetan Buddhist stuff. Do you know what I mean? You'd have the whole thing mixed up. Now, you might say to me, well, all the different religious traditions are the same. That's true and it's not true. It is true in the ultimate sense. The ultimate sense that, there is a fundamental ground of being. There is a God who's present in every flower and every breath that you take. God is closer to you than your own jugular vein. That's how close God is within you. Okay, that would mean that all prayer, all ritual is all the same. And yes, in that sense it is. But from the perspective of the individual person who wants to pray, you need to choose one particular thing. I think that's hugely important. If you think about it like food, all food is the same. All food nourishes. But it doesn't mean that you would go into a restaurant and just pick everything and eat all sorts of mixes. You pattern what you want to eat. You decide you're going to have the peri-peri chicken, and that's it. You don't have a burger with it. You don't mesh it all. You have one thing. And even in diet, no matter the fact that all food is the same, in diet, you usually pick very particular things and stick to them. You might have porridge with prunes in the morning, and that's what you have. That will do the job. So in the same way, when it comes, I think, to meditation, prayer, Buddhism versus Christianity, they're not in competition. But I always listen to that phrase of the Dalai Lama saying, don't make a soup. Don't just mix it all up. So, okay. So I usually tend to say, here is a rhythm coming for me now. The next 6 months, I will dedicate myself in a particular way towards icons, towards Christian icons. And in that, I will try to feel as completely as I can my full affirmation of the Christian faith. And then, sometimes I will withdraw from that. And I will fall back on the Buddhist practices, which are they're more psychological, they're more kind of reflective and rational. They're not, Buddhism is not a revealed religion. It is not stepping over a threshold where you say, I believe this is revealed by God. You're deducing it from your own side, from your own point of view. That's the Buddhist process. And both end up in the same place, which is, I suppose, what Buddhists would call enlightenment and what Christians call in the Orthodox theosis, absorption by God, that one is absorbed into God, absorbed into the light. Union with God. In Buddhist terms, dissolving the self and awakening to your true nature, your Buddha, enlightened nature. So the absorption is the true end of both, but they're different techniques. Amazing thing about Buddhism in Tibet is that they have 5 different schools of Tibetan Buddhism, and each school has a different emphasis or a different technique. And if you looked at them, in one sense you'd say, well, they're all different. But they're just different techniques getting you to the same place. And maybe that's the truth about Christianity as well, and maybe it's a truth that we're only beginning to realize, that the pathway through Roman Catholicism or Orthodoxy or Reformation traditions are all unique, different pathways leading to the same result. But it doesn't mean that you can pick and choose and make a soup of them all. You do have to choose, at least for a period. That's the way I look at it. I look at it like I kind of shape out ahead of me a season. Basically, that's how I do it. And I do that in the podcast, and I'm going to do it very, very much in the podcast in the next 3 months. Because, and you'll know this if you were listening to these podcasts last year or the year before, I love midwinter, and midwinter and Christmas gives me a shape, because you can feel it every day. The darkness is increasing, and if you ignore the darkness in your life, in the sky, you're not benefiting from it. The amazing thing is that this time of darkness in the winter, you can use it to trigger deep meditation. You can begin to think about this darkness as a kind of a darkness in which God is present, a darkness under which is light. Because the light of God in the Christian icon, the light that's behind Christ, radiating, is always painted in black or purple as a darkness, because it's a light that we can't even see, because it's so transcendent, and yet it is within us, but we experience it sometimes as darkness. So again, living on the outside, living the journey towards midwinter is in itself a meditation. It's a kind of a walking into the dark, but not in a nihilistic way, quite the opposite. Walking into the dark and feeling within it the mysterious embrace and tenderness of God's light, the radiant light of God. That's a beautiful way to go into the winter. So I usually shape out something. And I went over to Jampeling and I connected with them, and I spent the 2 hours saying the prayers and then maybe half an hour, 40 minutes chatting to people afterwards, and I came back so refreshed. And I thought, my goodness, I really miss having a place that I can go. And I don't have a church like that. I suppose Jampeling really is my church. And I miss that. And I had forgotten how much I missed it. So it was a lovely feeling to be back. And it was just the feeling that you would get if you have a parish or a monastery that you go to, or a meditation centre, whatever. A place where you feel you belong. Do you know? Where you're sharing the journey. The journey of solitude you're sharing with other people. Isn't that funny? Because they too are on the journey of solitude in their own life. And I think that there's nothing more deeper that you can share with somebody than your prayer journey. So just the very fact that I go over there and I sit with everybody else and we say our prayers, celebrating the long life of the Lama, and then we come out and we're having a cup of tea and a bun. I'm talking to people about the weather, and they're people I've known for 30 years. But I'm sharing in that moment with those people in the porch, I'm sharing at an extremely deep, intimate level. Because I know, without saying it, their faith journey is why they're there. They're there to pray. On the external level, they're connecting with their teacher. On the internal level, they are awakening to the joy, the Buddhahood, the Buddha light within themselves. And I'm doing the same. Now, we may not be getting there, but at least we're failing together. My teacher, this particular man, I remember saying one time, he was, after giving a big long 2-hour teaching on some very esoteric subject in Buddhism, and he was laughing, wondering did we understand it, and he says, maybe we will be enlightened, maybe not eventually, but always together. And he was kind of saying, it's the first time I thought about this when he said it, he was kind of saying, we're all in this room trying to struggle with the ideas of Buddhism because we're actually on the journey together. Now that goes exactly the same for, beautiful Orthodox communities. I visit one sometimes in Ireland. I feel a deep connection with a particular monastery, St. Elizabeth's Monastery in Belarus. I get this in parishes. I get it when I go to church in Drumshanbo. I get it when you go to a local church in Ireland. It's still very beautiful and very strong. And that sense that we're all kneeling together. And that as I journey into the solitude that is within me, and I struggle with the mystery of God in me, that this man or woman beside me at my shoulder is doing exactly the same thing. On the outside, we're just mouthing prayers. That's what it would look like. Amen. and with thy Spirit, thanks be to God, we raise them up to the Lord. All the usual rigmarole of prayers. And yet, there's something deeper, because what's happened on the outside is reflecting a search that's going on the inside to experience deep communion with the risen Christ. The journey of that 20 or 40 minutes is going to be a journey of encounter with the risen Christ in body and blood. That's what's happening on the inside. And the outside is the ritual that triggers it, links it, makes it. That's what they call, they used to use the word efficacious in theology. So they used to say that the Eucharist was an efficacious sacrament, meaning that it worked on the inside, meaning that when you went through the external ritual, something real had happened on the inside. And so that's a huge sense of unnameable intimacy with the person that's shoulder to shoulder with you in the church. And it's why I think I would really advocate for people to go to church, even though I don't do it on a regular basis myself. But I know that when I do it, and maybe this is the new pattern, maybe this is the new world we'll be living in another 10 years, that we'll let go of this regularity every Sunday. Maybe it is something that you do, every 4 weeks or 6 weeks or occasionally, but you do it. And certainly that's the way I do it, occasionally. But when I do it, I know that is the most important day in that sequence of 3 months. That's the day I go to church. And what I get from Jampeling is very similar, because it's a shared faith. And it has its ritual. Its ritual is efficacious. There's something happens in my heart, deep inside me. I can't name it. And then I come out and I'm having a cup of tea and chatting shoulder to shoulder at the door with somebody and asking them how their life is going and how their work is going. And both of us experience an intimacy that's profound, because we have both knelt together and prayed and gone through the rituals together. And that's one of the two things that I find hugely important when I go to Jampeling, which is the Tibetan Buddhist Centre in Cavan. The second thing, and this is true too, in Christian terms, in Islam, of course, in any religion, I believe, same thing. You must have a teacher. You can't do this stuff on your own. And I see that too as, don't make a soup. Don't make a soup of your religious practice. Now, it's very, very hard to get a teacher. You might call it a spiritual director, I don't know. I remember one fella telling us when we were in the seminary and I was training to be a priest, and there was a fella advising us one day about always make sure that when you're a priest you have a spiritual director. And he quoted somebody famous who said, even if it's only a friend down the road, you just must have somebody who's advising you. And it must be somebody who, this is, John at the Cross says this, it must be somebody who has the road maps for the territory that you are going to journey in. So John at the Cross is hugely emphatic about this. He says, you do not go to somebody who does not have the road maps for the territory that you wish to explore. You must get somebody who you intuitively are able to say, I trust that person because I feel that person has already done the journey that I feel I'm doing at this moment in my life. You might be young and you might be in a kind of big transition, maybe at, late 20s or early 30s, and there's whole new ways you're looking at world, and you're thinking, maybe I shouldn't be in this career, maybe I should be a different career and all the rest of it. And you need advice. You need somebody who's older and wiser and who has been there and done that. And they will be a good advisor. And the same when it comes to the deep and unnameable ways that we think about our faith life, our attachment and faith in Jesus, or, the joy we get, let's say, out of Buddhist practice, whatever it be, or what you should do next. That's it. What should I be reading? What practices ought I be doing? I don't do a whole lot of different Buddhist practices. I do terribly simple little things, and they are things that my teacher told me to do. Told me to do 30 years ago. I'm still doing them, haven't changed. They're not sophisticated, they're just simple little prayers and practices. But always have a spiritual director. You need a doctor, you need a therapist, but neither of those can suffice for a spiritual director. Somebody who's a person of faith and who knows the territory and who has the road maps. That's the kind of person you need. So those two things came to me big time during the week. The sense of joy that I get when I connect with a faith group, whether it be Buddhist or Christian. And secondly, the strength I get when I'm able to say, yes, I have a teacher. He is aware of my most personal attempts to pray and to find enlightenment, or whatever you want to call it. I have somebody who I go to for advice. And it doesn't mean that you blindly take advice either. As I say, you must always be trying to discern that your teacher has the roadmaps. You must always be alert to the possibility that you hear your teacher saying something and your heart disagrees with it in a way that your heart, your conscience, knows what he is saying is not correct. That is not suitable for me. And at that stage, you withdraw and you go in search of a teacher. I'm not talking about searching for a teacher who agrees with you. Very often that's the thing that your conscience will tell you is not good. If your teacher is constantly affirming you, so much so that like everything you tell him or her, they're saying, oh yeah, well that's right, that's good, all is good, You need somebody who also challenges you. I remember saying to my teacher one time, he saw me smoking. And I says to him, he said, oh, you're smoking. And I said, culture. Now, the reason I was saying that was I had been in Mongolia with him. And sometimes you'd come across some very strange practice in Mongolia. Like, they used to put rancid butter on a baby's cheek. And the cheek would turn into those blue cobwebs. They don't do it now, by the way, but in the years ago they used to do this, and they used to think it was a sign, a mark of beauty, if you don't mind. And then when they grow up, you'd see sometimes Mongolians, and the two cheeks would be full of little blue cobwebby shapes. This was done with butter when the poor unfortunate person was a baby. And I remember one time going into a tent in Mongolia, and there was a nurse with us, Heidi from Switzerland, and she was horrified. And oh, this is terrible! Like, oh, look at this! This is awful what they're doing with this child. But the teacher, Rinpoche, he kind of threw up his hands a little bit, and he just said culture. In other words, there's certain aspects of life which is cultural, And you cannot just come in a colonial way and say, change that. So from a Buddhist point of view, he would have to just try and situate the teachings within the culture, and sometimes there has to be a sort of a compromise between the teachings and the culture. Another example of it would be if you go into a culture where people eat a lot of meat, and they're not going to stop eating meat, so it kind of slightly goes against the principle of not killing, which is one of the major precepts of Buddhism. But again, the Rinpoche would say, well, it's culture, so you can't be just dividing the line there. And so when he looked at me and saw the cigarette in my hand, and he said, "Oh, you're smoking." I said, "Culture. We do that here." And he roared laughing. And his laughter was telling me, "Michael, don't be fooling yourself. Give up the cigarettes." Do you see what I mean? When you get to know a teacher sometimes, you can be blessed. You begin to read very, very subtle silences, and you understand what's being said in the silence. So, there's the two things. And I felt this week, because I was in Portlaoise last night. I'm down here in a hotel. I'm going out to a gig now. I did my own gig at 1 o'clock. Busy, busy, busy. I'm longing for the silence and the cloister. The trees, the little woodland around the house, and the lake below, the mountain in the distance, and the 3 cats, 2 of them snoozing on the sofa, and the other poor little creature out of the back door. I'm longing for that tranquility, that cave, that place that when I go to, I'm able to enter into the room in my own heart. And so when I'm out here on the stormy sea of social engagements and talking to people and meeting people, I started thinking too of how valuable religious tradition is. Whether it be Christian, whether it be Buddhist, whether it be anything else that you have, it's very precious and it's very valuable. And 2 little insights I think about it. One is the value of actually praying together. Going to a church and praying, even if you did it once, one mass, one divine service, one prayer meeting, just once in 12 months. Just tell yourself you're going to do it once between now and Christmas. If you don't do it, and if you do it on a regular basis, just enjoy it all the more. Because you are blessed to have a community. You are blessed to be part and to belong to something where the intimacy that you're sharing your faith, and yet the person beside you is doing the same. You're communicating and sharing at a very deep level. That's very rich. And the other is that within that system, find a teacher. No matter who it is, man, woman, young or old, ordained or not ordained, doesn't matter. Somebody who's spiritual. Somebody that you can confide in and ask their advice. I'm still here, by the way. Sometimes I come to those moments where, there's a silence in the room and I'm thinking about you. And somebody else would edit the tape. But I don't do that. I don't like to edit the tapes. I like to leave the silences so that I'm in silence. And it's like I can't put words in it anymore. I've said my piece. I feel your presence. And that's it. And thank you for being here. Bye-bye.